Imagine you're 40 years old and you've never known the touch of another soul. Not a handshake that lingered, not a hand on your shoulder. Nothing. For Samuel Crawford, this wasn't imagination. This was his life. Out in the raw, unforgiving wilderness of 1880s Montana, his only companions were the wind, his cattle, and a silence so deep it had its own sound. He was a man carved from the land itself, weathered and solitary. He figured he'd die that way, alone on his 200 acres of harsh paradise, his story told only by the lines on his face. But on one night, when the sky tore open and threw a biblical storm at his doorstep, his decades of solitude were about to be shattered. A single knock was all it took. A knock that would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about loneliness, and about the brutal cost of a second chance. Stay with us, because what happens next is a story so twisted, it'll challenge everything you think you know about love in the Old West. The autumn wind of 1884 was a bitter thing, carrying the scent of dying grass and the promise of a hard winter. Samuel Crawford, all 42 years of him, moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done the same chores, in the same order, for more years than he cared to count. He latched the barn doors, his hands cracked and calloused, his movements as predictable as the setting sun. His face was a map of his life. Prairie sun had burned deep lines into his skin, and bitter winters had etched their own story around his eyes. His hair, salted with gray, he trimmed himself with a pair of rusty scissors. His clothes, worn flannel and patched denim, hung loose on his tall, lean frame. Behind him, his small ranch house stood just as solitary as its owner. 2 rooms, a stone chimney puffing a thin ribbon of smoke, and windows that had never known the softness of a woman's curtains. "Easy there, Belle," he murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. His favorite mare, Belle, nuzzled his shoulder. It was the closest thing to real affection he'd felt in years. He let his hand linger on her warm neck, drawing a small bit of comfort from the animal as lightning spiderwebbed across the distant, bruised sky. The truth Samuel carried was a secret shame, heavier than any bale of hay he'd ever hoisted. Down at the general store in Copper Ridge, a dusty town 15 miles away, men his age talked of their wives, their children, their lives. Samuel just stayed quiet. How could he possibly explain it? That a man so capable, a man who could mend any fence and birth a calf in a blizzard, had never once known the intimate touch of a woman. His parents had been taken by fever when he was just 18, leaving him the land and a crushing weight of responsibility that had shaped his entire adult life. His 20s were a blur of work, of building the ranch from nothing, telling himself there'd be time for courtship later. His 30s slipped by in a haze of harsh winters and failed harvests, each passing year making him more awkward, more closed off from the few available women in their sparse community. Now, at 42, the idea of admitting his inexperience filled him with a burn deeper and hotter than the midday prairie sun. It was a failure he felt in his bones. The storm hit without any more warning. It came with a fury that turned the world outside into a churning nightmare of wind and water. Rain hammered his tin roof like 1,000 tiny bullets. Samuel sat by his fireplace, the only light in the house coming from a single oil lamp mending a bridle. The rhythmic work was a comfort, a familiar pattern in a world of chaos. And then he heard it. 3 sharp knocks on his door. His hands froze. The leather and tools fell from his lap. In all his years on this ranch, no one, not a single soul, had ever knocked on his door after sunset. Especially not in a storm like this. He crept to the rain-streaked window, peering into the violent dark. He could just make out a figure, hunched against the wind. A dark cloak whipped around them. It was a woman. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear and something else, something he couldn't name. What in God's name would bring a woman to his remote doorstep on a night like this? A voice, faint but clear, cut through the howl of the wind. "Please, I need shelter. My wagon. The wheel broke about a mile back. This storm." The voice was refined, desperate. It didn't belong out here. Samuel's hand, trembling, rested on the wooden latch. 42 years he'd been on this earth. 42 years, and he had never once been alone with a woman inside his own home. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. He couldn't leave her out there. No matter what his fear was screaming at him, he just couldn't. He took a deep breath and he pulled the door open. What he saw wasn't what he expected. The woman who stood on his threshold was unlike any he'd ever seen in Copper Ridge. Even soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her head, there was an elegance about her, a refinement that spoke of eastern cities and a life he couldn't possibly imagine. Her auburn hair had streaks of premature gray, and her green eyes, wide with fear and relief, held a dignity the storm hadn't managed to wash away. "Ma'am," Samuel stammered, his voice cracking as he stepped back to let her in. "Please, come in from the cold." She hurried inside, relief washing over her face as water dripped from her woolen cloak, forming a small puddle on his rough-hewn floor. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe a little older, and she carried herself like someone used to far better circumstances. Her dress, though stained with mud and torn at the hem, was made of fine material. It had once been expensive. "I'm Eleanor Morrison," she said, her hands shaking as she unfastened her cloak. "I was traveling from Billings to my sister's homestead near Fort Benton. The wheel it snapped clean off. I am so terribly sorry to impose on you." "No imposition," Samuel managed to reply, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Her refined accent sounded strange in his sparse cabin, like a melody played on a broken fiddle. "I'm Samuel Crawford. Let me get you something dry." He practically fled into his small bedroom, his mind racing. He returned with his cleanest shirt and a pair of thick woolen socks, his best ones. "These will have to do until your things dry by the fire," he said, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor as he handed them to her. You can change behind that screen there." As Eleanor disappeared behind the privacy screen, Samuel busied himself, stoking the fire until it roared, putting a pot of coffee on to boil. His hands were unsteady. The storm showed no sign of letting up. He realized, with a fresh jolt of panic, that she would have to stay the night. The thought sent his pulse into a frantic rhythm, a chaotic mix of raw anticipation and pure, unadulterated terror. He'd never had a guest before. Not really. Not like this. "Mr. Crawford." Her voice came from behind the screen, soft and questioning. "Might I ask, do you live here all alone?" "Yes, ma'am," he answered, the words coming out harsher, more bitter than he'd intended. "Always have." A moment later, Eleanor emerged. She was wearing his shirt. It was huge on her, falling nearly to her knees like a dress. And in that moment, seeing her standing there, vulnerable, and yet so graceful in the flickering firelight, Samuel felt something deep inside his chest shift. Something old and frozen began to thaw. When she offered him a small, grateful smile, he felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "You're very kind," she said, taking the chair he offered opposite his own. "I must confess I was terrified out there. When my wagon broke, I saw no other lights. This country, it can be so terribly empty." "Gets lonely," Samuel admitted, the honesty of the words surprising even himself. "But you learn to manage it." Eleanor studied his face, her gaze intelligent and perceptive. In the warm glow of the fire, she could see the profound sadness etched into the lines around his mouth and eyes. "How long have you been out here?" 24 years, he said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, his movements slow and deliberate. "Since my parents passed, built most of what you see with my own 2 hands." That's truly impressive, she said, accepting the cup. Her fingers brushed against his for a fraction of a second, and a jolt, like a tiny spark of lightning, shot up his arm. I can see why you'd be proud of it. Though, it must be difficult, managing everything on your own. Samuel settled back into his chair, acutely, painfully aware of her presence. The room felt smaller, fuller. The storm raged on outside, a wild symphony of nature's fury. But inside, with this strange, elegant woman sharing his fire, his little house felt more like a home than it ever had before. "What takes you to Fort Benton, if you don't mind my asking?" he asked, trying to fill the silence. Eleanor's expression clouded over, a deep sadness entering her eyes. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He died 6 months ago. Consumption. I'm going to live with my sister and her family. They have a small farm there." She paused, staring into the dark coffee in her cup. Sometimes starting over is the only way forward." The raw pain in her voice resonated with a deep, lonely part of Samuel he kept hidden from the world. Here was someone else who knew loss, someone else who understood the crushing weight of loneliness. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Eleanor, please." She looked up, and her eyes held a depth of experience, a world of sorrow and strength that he could barely comprehend. "And thank you. Charles was a good man, but he was sick for so long. Towards the end, sometimes I wonder if I even remember what it feels like to not be afraid." Samuel found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her quiet vulnerability. "Afraid of what?" "Of being alone," she said, her voice catching. "Of not being needed. Of—" She hesitated, then seemed to find a hidden reserve of courage. "Of never feeling truly alive again." And in that single, devastating confession, Samuel recognized a kindred spirit. It was as if she had reached into his chest and pulled out his own secret, unspoken fear. She understood. She knew what it was like to just go through the motions, to exist instead of live. The storm outside seemed to fade into a distant murmur. They sat there in a comfortable silence, two strangers, two lonely souls who had found an unexpected and profound comfort in a shared fire on a dark and stormy night. But as Samuel watched her, a small, nagging detail surfaced in his mind. Her hands. For a woman who claimed she'd just been in a wagon crash, who had walked a mile through a muddy, violent storm, her hands were remarkably clean. Her fingernails were perfectly filed, without a trace of dirt or grime. It was a small thing, a meaningless detail, probably. He pushed it away. He had to be imagining things. After all, what reason would she have to lie? Dawn broke gray and heavy, the storm gone but leaving behind a world soaked in mud and transformed. Samuel had slept on the rough floor by the fireplace, having insisted Eleanor take his bed. When he woke, his back aching, he found her already awake. She was standing by the window, still in his shirt, but now with her own skirt, which had dried by the fire. She was watching the sun paint the vast prairie in strokes of gold and amber. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft without turning around. "I'd forgotten how magnificent a sunrise can be when you're not looking at it through the grime of city buildings." Samuel got to his feet, feeling clumsy and awkward in her presence. He still didn't know how to act, how to navigate this strange new reality of sharing his space. "The land, it grows on you," he said. "Some folks find it too empty, too quiet." "I think," she replied, finally turning to face him, "I think I needed the quiet." In the clear morning light, he could see the exhaustion etched on her face, but there was something else there, too. A spark, a flicker of life in her eyes that seemed brighter than it had been the night before. "Thank you again for letting me stay," she said. "I hope I didn't make you too uncomfortable." "No, ma'am." "Eleanor," Samuel corrected himself, feeling a flush of heat rise in his cheeks. Truth is, it was nice. Having someone to talk to. Gets pretty silent out here most of the time. An easy, surprising rhythm developed between them as they prepared a simple breakfast of bacon and eggs. Their movements seemed to complement each other, a domestic dance that felt both foreign and incredibly comfortable. Samuel found himself stealing glances at her, at the graceful way she moved, the gentle efficiency of her hands. When their fingers accidentally brushed as they both reached for the same plate, he felt that same jolt of electricity, stronger this time. It was a feeling he'd never experienced before, and it left him breathless. They sat down at his small wooden table to eat. The silence was different now, not empty but filled with unspoken things. Samuel, Eleanor said, her voice serious, breaking the quiet, may I ask you something personal? His heart started hammering again. I suppose. Last night, she began, choosing her words carefully. When I mentioned being afraid of being alone, the look on your face. You looked like you understood that feeling all too well. Have you truly been alone here all these years? The question was so direct, so pointed, it caught him completely off guard. He couldn't meet her gaze. He stared down into his coffee cup as if the answers were written in the dark liquid. The old shame, hot and familiar, burned in his throat. Yes, he mumbled, always been alone. By choice? Her voice wasn't judging. It was just curious, gentle. Samuel's hands clenched into fists around his warm cup. This was it, the moment of his deepest humiliation. Not exactly by choice. No, he forced the words out. I never learned how to, you know. I've never been good with people. He couldn't finish. He couldn't say the words. Then he felt a touch. Eleanor had reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was gentle, warm, and completely devoid of pity. It was a touch of pure understanding. You've never been with a woman, she stated. It wasn't a question. He couldn't speak. He could only manage a slow, miserable nod, his eyes still fixed on the table. 42 years old, he whispered, the shame finally spilling out. And I've never... God, you must think I'm pathetic. I think, Eleanor said, her voice firm, compelling him to finally look up at her. I think you are one of the kindest, most genuine men I have ever met, and I think that the right person just hasn't crossed your path yet. He looked up, startled by the intensity in her gaze. Her eyes held something he couldn't name. It was compassion, yes, but there was something else there, something warmer, more personal, a flicker of heat that made his stomach flutter. Charles and I, she continued, her voice growing softer, more intimate. We had a good marriage, but it was comfortable, safe. I loved him, but I sometimes wondered. I wondered what it would feel like to be with someone who could make me feel... She trailed off, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Feel passion. The word hung in the air between them, electric and charged with possibility. Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. Eleanor's hand was still on his, her thumb now tracing small, hypnotic circles on his knuckles. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, a flood of sensation in his starved world. I need to check on your wagon, he said abruptly, pulling his hand away and standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. See about fixing that wheel. Eleanor nodded, a look of understanding in her eyes. But her gaze held a promise, a silent invitation that made Samuel's pulse race faster than it ever had. Of course, she said. But Samuel, I hope you know there is nothing shameful about innocence. Sometimes it's a gift. As Samuel walked through the thick mud towards the spot where her wagon lay abandoned, her words echoed in his mind. A gift. No one had ever called his crippling loneliness a gift. For the first time in his life, someone had looked past his inexperience, past his shame, and had seen something worthwhile. He found the wagon tilted at a crazy angle, one rear wheel completely shattered. It would take at least a day, maybe two, to repair it properly. He'd have to fashion a new spoke from the seasoned oak he kept in his barn. A whole day, maybe more. And a day that had once seemed like just another stretch of empty hours now felt full of terrifying, unprecedented possibilities. As he got closer to the broken wagon, however, another detail snagged his attention. The break in the wheel. It wasn't clean. It didn't look like it had snapped under the strain of the road. It looked intentional. The wood was splintered outwards, as if from a heavy blow, like someone had taken an axe to it. The wagon wheel was more damaged than he'd first thought. It required him to carefully fashion a new spoke from a piece of seasoned oak he kept in the barn, a task that required all his focus and skill. Throughout the day, Eleanor proved to be a surprisingly capable helper. She held tools for him, her presence in his normally solitary workshop a strange comfort. She organized his cluttered workspace, prepared their meals, and filled the long hours with conversation. Their talks grew deeper, more intimate. They were like two explorers, cautiously mapping the lonely landscapes of each other's pasts. They shared stories of their youth, their small triumphs, their quiet disappointments. With each shared secret, the walls they had built around their hearts crumbled just a little bit more. That evening they sat together on his small porch. The sky, washed clean by the storm, was a vast blanket of brilliant stars. The air was cool and crisp. "Tell me about your dreams," Eleanor said, her voice soft in the quiet night. "When you were a young man, what did you imagine your life would become?" Samuel whittled at a small piece of wood, the shavings falling silently to the porch floor. He considered her question, something no one had ever asked him before. "I used to think I'd have a family by now," he admitted, his voice low. "A house full of noise, children running around, maybe expand the ranch, buy the neighboring plot." He glanced over at her, a faint, embarrassed smile on his face. "Sounds foolish, I suppose, saying it out loud." "It sounds beautiful," Eleanor said, her voice gentle. "Not foolish at all." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze lost in the sea of stars above. "What about you? Did you dream of anything beyond the life you had?" "I dreamed of feeling alive," she said finally, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. "Truly alive. Charles was a good, decent man. But our marriage was practical, an arrangement of comfort and convenience. I sometimes lay awake at night and wondered what it would feel like to be truly wanted, not just needed." The raw vulnerability in her confession made Samuel put down his whittling knife. In the faint starlight, Eleanor looked almost ethereal, her auburn hair, now clean and dry, falling loose around her shoulders. She looked beautiful and sad. "You are wanted," he heard himself say, the words quiet but firm. "I mean, I want—" He trailed off, frustrated by his inability to articulate the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Eleanor turned to face him fully, her green eyes searching his in the darkness. "What is it that you want, Samuel?" The question hung between them, heavy with promise and a terrifying amount of possibility. Samuel felt 42 years of crushing loneliness pressing in on him, warring with a lifetime of fear and inexperience. "I want to not be afraid anymore," he said, the admission a painful whisper. "I want to know what it feels like to hold someone, to be held. I want—" He looked directly into her eyes, forcing himself to be brave. "I want to know what it feels like to be alive with someone else." Slowly, Eleanor moved closer to him on the porch step until their knees were touching. The small point of contact sent a tremor through his entire body. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice a warm breath in the cool night air. You don't have to be afraid. Not with me. And then she leaned forward and she kissed him. The world tilted on its axis. Her lips were softer, warmer than anything he could have ever imagined. It was a gentle, questioning kiss. And when she started to pull back, he found himself following her, deepening the kiss with an instinct he never knew he possessed. Decades of longing, of isolation, of silent heartache, all of it melted away in that single perfect moment. It was replaced by a fire that spread from his lips through his entire being, warming places inside him that had been cold for a lifetime. Eleanor, he breathed against her lips, his mind reeling. I I don't know how. I don't want to disappoint you. She cupped his face in her hands, her touch tender, her thumbs gently tracing the weathered lines around his eyes. You could never disappoint me, she whispered. Just be yourself, Samuel. Just be present with me. Later that night, in the soft, flickering lamplight of his small bedroom, Eleanor gently guided him through his first intimate encounter. She was patient and tender and full of a quiet reverence that chased away all his fear. She taught him the unspoken language of touch, the gentle rhythm of desire, the profound, earth-shattering connection that comes from being completely, utterly vulnerable with another person. And Samuel discovered something amazing. His inexperience, the thing he had been so ashamed of for so long, wasn't a weakness at all. It allowed him to be completely present, to be attentive to her every breath, her every sigh. It allowed him to learn her body with a sense of wonder and awe that a more experienced man might have long since lost. "You're beautiful," Eleanor whispered as they lay tangled together afterwards, her head resting on his chest, her hair spread like a silken shawl across his skin. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Samuel stroked her hair, his mind still struggling to believe that any of this was real, that this incredible woman was here, in his arms, in his bed. "Thank you," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving." In the days that followed, the idea of Eleanor leaving for Fort Benton became a more and more distant concern. The wagon was repaired, but she always found another reason to stay. She helped him with the ranch chores, her presence a constant, welcome surprise. She taught him small domestic comforts he'd never known, like how a few wildflowers in a jar on the table could brighten up the whole room. They shared their dreams for the future, dreams that, more and more, seemed to include each other. A month later, Eleanor Morrison became Eleanor Crawford. The ceremony was a simple one, held at the small church in Copper Ridge, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. The lonely rancher who had lived for 42 years without love had found not just a wife, but a true partner, a soulmate who understood the depths of his solitude because she had known her own. Samuel's ranch, once a stark monument to his isolation, was transformed. It became a home filled with laughter, with conversation, and with the quiet, profound intimacy of two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their hearts. One afternoon, a few weeks into their marriage, Eleanor was organizing some of the few belongings she'd brought with her. Samuel watched her from the doorway, a feeling of deep contentment settling over him. He saw her pull a small, leather-bound book from her travel case. It looked like a diary. She opened it, and a folded piece of paper fell out. She quickly snatched it up, but not before Samuel saw it. It was a photograph, a portrait of a handsome man with a severe expression and cold, dark eyes. "Who's that?" Samuel asked gently. Eleanor froze, her back to him. That's Charles," she said, her voice strained. "My late husband." Something about her tone made the hair on Samuel's arms stand up. He walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Eleanor, are you all right?" She turned to face him, and her face was pale, her eyes filled with a fear he hadn't seen since that first night. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something I have to tell you, Something I should have told you from the very beginning. Charles, my husband, he isn't dead." The floor seemed to drop out from under Samuel's feet. The quiet contentment of his new life shattered into a million pieces. "What? What are you talking about? You told me he died of consumption." Tears began to stream down Eleanor's face. "I lied," she choked out. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I was so desperate." He stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. His wife, the woman who had filled his empty life with light and laughter, was a liar. Their entire relationship, their marriage, it was all built on a lie. A cold, hard knot of betrayal formed in his stomach. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice flat and empty. "My name is Eleanor Morrison," she sobbed. "That part is true, but my husband, Charles, is very much alive. He's a monster, Samuel, a cruel, abusive man." She pulled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing a faint, discolored bruise on her upper arm, shaped like a man's fingers. "He's a wealthy man, a powerful man in Billings. I wasn't going to my sister's. I don't even have a sister. I was running away, running for my life." The story spilled out of her in a torrent of fear and desperation. Charles wasn't just abusive. He was possessive and controlling. He had kept her a virtual prisoner in their lavish home. She had finally found the courage to escape, taking what little money and jewelry she could, and fleeing in the night. "The wagon wheel," Samuel said, the memory of the strange, splintered break flashing in his mind. "It didn't just break, did it?" She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "No. When I saw your ranch, so isolated, so far from the main road, I knew it was my only chance. I broke the wheel myself, with a rock. I needed a reason to stop. I needed a place to hide. I saw you, Samuel. I watched you for an hour before I knocked. I saw the kindness in your face when you spoke to your horse. I took a chance, a desperate, foolish chance." Samuel felt a storm of conflicting emotions warring inside him. Anger, betrayal. But looking at her, seeing the genuine terror in her eyes, he also felt a deep, gut-wrenching pity. And despite the lies, despite everything, the love he felt for her was still there, an aching, undeniable presence in his chest. "He'll be looking for me," she whispered, her voice laced with panic. "Charles will never let me go. He sees me as his property. He will hunt me to the ends of the earth." Samuel was no longer just a lonely rancher who had found love. He was a man married to a fugitive, a man harboring a runaway wife from a powerful and dangerous husband. His quiet, simple life was over. He now had a choice to make. He could send her away, wash his hands of her and her dangerous secrets, and return to his safe, empty solitude. Or he could protect her. He could stand between this woman he had grown to love and the monster she was running from. He looked at Eleanor, at her tear-streaked face, at the desperate hope in her eyes. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that there was no choice at all. His old life was gone. She was his life now. "Let him come," Samuel said, his voice low and steady. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "Let him try to take you. He'll have to come through me first." They lived in a state of nervous tension for the next few weeks. Every distant sound, every rider on the horizon, sent a jolt of fear through them. But in that shared fear, a new, stronger bond was forged between them. The initial romance, born of loneliness and tenderness, was now tempered by danger and a fierce, protective instinct. Samuel found a strength within himself he never knew he possessed. He wasn't just a husband. He was a guardian. One morning, as Samuel was chopping wood, he saw a rider approaching. Not from the direction of town, but from the east. The man was dressed smartly, in a city suit that looked out of place in the rugged Montana landscape. He rode a fine horse, and he carried himself with an air of confidence that set Samuel on edge. He gripped the handle of his axe, his knuckles white. The man reined in his horse a few yards away and dismounted. He was tall, with a clean-shaven face and intelligent, watchful eyes. He tipped his hat politely. "Mr. Crawford, Samuel Crawford." "That's me," Samuel said, not moving from his spot. "My name is Agent Peters," the man said, extending a hand. Samuel ignored it. "I'm with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. A Pinkerton. Here, on his ranch. It could only mean one thing. "I've been hired by a Mr. Charles Morrison of Billings," Peters continued, his eyes scanning the ranch, taking in every detail. "He's looking for his wife, a Mrs. Eleanor Morrison. She went missing a couple of months ago. There was some concern she may have met with foul play out here in the wilderness. Her trail went cold, not far from here. You wouldn't have happened to have seen a woman of her description, would you?" Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he was sure the detective could hear it. He forced himself to remain calm, to keep his face a mask of neutral curiosity. "Can't say that I have," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "My wife and I, we keep to ourselves mostly." The detective's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Your wife?" "My apologies, Mr. Crawford. Our information must have been outdated. We had you listed as unmarried." "We were married recently," Samuel said, his voice tight. "My wife, Eleanor, she came through here a while back. Her wagon broke down. I helped her fix it. One thing led to another." He hoped the story sounded plausible. Just then the cabin door opened and Eleanor stepped out. She froze when she saw the detective, the color draining from her face. "Well, well," Peters said, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "Speak of the devil. Mrs. Morrison, I presume, or should I say Mrs. Crawford?" The detective, Peters, was smooth, dangerously smooth. He stayed for what felt like an eternity, accepting Samuel's reluctant offer of coffee and making polite, probing conversation. He congratulated them on their recent marriage, his eyes never losing their sharp, analytical glint. He asked Eleanor about her journey, about the broken wagon, about her decision to marry so quickly. Eleanor, to Samuel's amazement, was a brilliant actress. She played the part of a flustered but happy newlywed perfectly. She spun a tale of a whirlwind romance, of two lonely people finding solace in each other, a story so convincing that for a moment Samuel almost forgot it was a lie. She claimed her husband Charles had died months prior, and she had been on her way to start a new life when fate intervened. "It's a remarkable story," Peters said, sipping his coffee. "Almost like something out of a dime novel. A grieving widow finds love in the arms of a rugged frontiersman." His smile was polite, but his eyes were cold. "Mr. Morrison will be so relieved to hear that you're safe and sound. He was terribly worried." The veiled threat hung in the air. This wasn't just a search for a missing person. This was a retrieval. "There must be some mistake," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband Charles passed away. This man who hired you must be a different Mr. Morrison." "I don't think so, ma'am," Peters said, placing his cup down. "Charles Morrison of Billings, banking, railroads, a very influential man. A man who does not like to lose things that belong to him." He stood up, tipping his hat once more. "Thank you for the coffee. I'll be sure to pass along the news. I'm sure Mr. Morrison will want to come and offer his congratulations in person." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in his wake. "He didn't believe us," Eleanor whispered, her body shaking. "Not for a second." "No," Samuel agreed, his jaw tight. "He was just scouting. He was confirming you were here. The next 24 hours were a special kind of hell. They were trapped, waiting for the inevitable. They talked about running, but where could they go? Morrison had the money and the resources to find them anywhere. Their only chance was here, on Samuel's land, the only place he knew well enough to defend. The next afternoon they arrived. 2 wagons came rumbling down the path to his ranch. In the lead wagon sat the detective, Peters. Beside him was a man who could only be Charles Morrison. He was just as handsome as his photograph, dressed in an expensive suit, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes were like chips of ice. In the second wagon were 2 men, big, brutal-looking thugs whose only purpose was clearly intimidation. Samuel and Eleanor stood together on the porch, a united front. Samuel held his old hunting rifle, though his hands were slick with sweat. "Eleanor, my dear," Charles said, stepping down from the wagon, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Did you really think you could hide from me out here in this squalor?" He looked at Samuel with utter contempt. "And this is what you've replaced me with? A dirt-streaked farmer?" "Stay away from her, Morrison," Samuel warned, his voice shaking but firm. Charles laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're in no position to be making demands, Crawford. You see, my wife didn't just run away from our sacred marriage vows. She stole something from me. Something very, very valuable." Samuel looked at Eleanor, confused. She had never mentioned stealing anything other than a bit of money and jewelry. "He's lying," Eleanor said, her voice thin. "Am I?" Charles sneered. "Tell me, my love, where did you put my accounting ledgers, the little black books you so cleverly removed from my safe before you fled?" He turned his icy gaze back to Samuel. "You see, farmer, your new bride hasn't just committed adultery, she's a thief. And those books, they contain certain sensitive business details that the law might find very interesting. Details that could ruin me." Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about a broken heart or a spurned husband. This was about self-preservation. Charles didn't want his wife back. He wanted those ledgers. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eleanor said, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a flicker of fear, but also of triumph. "Oh, I think you do," Charles said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And we are going to find them. Peters, you and your men can start with the house, tear it apart, every floorboard, every wall. And as for you two," he said, gesturing to Samuel and Eleanor, "you're going to stay right here with me, and you're going to tell me where they are." The world had shrunk to the size of Samuel's small ranch. Charles and his hired thugs, whose names were Jeb and Billy, were methodical and brutal. They started with the house, turning over furniture, ripping open mattresses, smashing the few precious things Samuel and Eleanor owned. The sound of destruction was a constant, grinding torture. Charles sat on the porch step, calmly cleaning his fingernails with a small silver knife, while Samuel and Eleanor were forced to watch. The Pinkerton, Peters, directed the search with a cold, professional detachment. "This is pointless, Charles," Eleanor said, her voice defiant despite the circumstances. "I don't have them." "Oh, I believe you," Charles said without looking up. "I don't think you'd be foolish enough to keep them on your person or in your luggage. No, you're smarter than that, my dear, which is why I always found you so entertaining. You hid them. Somewhere here, somewhere on this pathetic little farm." He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto Samuel's. "And if she won't tell me where they are, perhaps you will." Jeb, one of the large thugs, grabbed Samuel from behind, twisting his arm painfully behind his back. "Leave him alone," Eleanor screamed. "Tell me where the books are, Eleanor," Charles said, his voice dangerously calm. "Or my associate will break your husband's arm, and then he'll move on to other, more breakable parts." Samuel gritted his teeth, the pain in his arm excruciating. He looked at Eleanor, at the terror and indecision on her face. He knew she had the ledgers. and he knew she was trying to protect him. "I swear, Charles, I don't know," she cried. "Wrong answer," Charles sighed. He gave a slight nod to Jeb. Samuel braced himself for the snap of bone, but then he had an idea, a desperate, wild idea. "The old well," Samuel grunted through the pain. "There's an old, dry well, back behind the barn. That's the only place she could have hidden them." Charles looked at him, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Is he telling the truth, my dear?" Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're at the bottom of the well." It was a lie. Samuel had no idea where the ledgers were, but he knew the old well. It was deep, and the stone lining was crumbling and unstable. It was the most dangerous spot on his property. And it was far away from the house. It was a chance. Maybe their only chance. "Excellent," Charles said, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Peters, take Billy and go fetch them. Jeb, you stay here with me. Keep our lovebirds company." As the detective and one of the thugs headed towards the barn, Samuel caught Eleanor's eye. He gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood. This wasn't a surrender. It was a diversion. He was buying them time. But for what, he still didn't know. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds of Peters and Billy working at the old well, the creak of a rope, the scrape of tools against stone, drifted back to the porch. Charles grew impatient, pacing back and forth. Samuel's mind was racing, scanning every inch of his property, every tool, every piece of equipment, searching for a weapon, for an advantage. His eyes landed on the large stack of firewood he'd been chopping earlier. Next to it was a heavy-duty rope and pulley system he used for hoisting hay into the barn loft. An idea began to form, a crazy, dangerous idea. He knew he had to separate Charles from his remaining thug, Jeb. "The rope they're using might not be strong enough," Samuel said, his voice raspy. "I've got a stronger one in the barn. If they fall—" Charles considered this for a moment. He was impatient. He wanted his ledgers. "Fine," he snapped. "Jeb, go with him. Make sure he doesn't try anything stupid." This was it, his chance. As Samuel and the hulking Jeb walked towards the barn, Samuel's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every detail of his plan had to be perfect. The timing had to be precise. "The rope's up in the loft," Samuel said, pointing upwards as they entered the dim, dusty barn. Jeb grunted and followed him towards the ladder. As Jeb placed his heavy boot on the first rung, Samuel acted. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he grabbed a nearby pitchfork and slammed the handle with all his might against the back of Jeb's knees. The big man roared in pain and surprise, his legs buckling. He tumbled backwards, crashing to the dirt floor. He wasn't knocked out, but he was stunned, dazed. Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy barn door, the one with the broken latch he'd been meaning to fix, and slammed it shut, dropping the thick wooden crossbar into place. Jeb was trapped inside, bellowing with rage and pounding on the thick oak planks. One down. Now for Charles. Samuel raced back to the house. Charles was on the porch, his back to him, shouting impatiently towards the well. "What's taking so long?" Samuel didn't make a sound. He crept up the porch steps, his blood roaring in his ears. He saw the axe he'd been using earlier, still lying by the woodpile. He snatched it up. It felt heavy, deadly in his hands. This was a tool for splitting wood, not for fighting. But it was all he had. He was a farmer, a quiet man who had never raised a hand to another soul in his life. But in that moment, for Eleanor, he was willing to become a killer. "Morrison!" he yelled. Charles spun around, his eyes wide with shock, as he saw Samuel standing there, axe in hand. His hand instantly went to the inside of his coat, pulling out a small, pearl-handled derringer. But Samuel was closer. He didn't swing the axe to kill. He swung it like he was chopping a log, aiming for the gun. The heavy blade connected with Charles's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone and a scream of agony. The derringer flew from Charles's shattered hand and skittered across the porch. Charles collapsed, clutching his ruined wrist, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. Just then, Peters and Billy came running from behind the barn. "What the hell is going on?" Peters shouted, drawing his own revolver. But before he could take aim, Eleanor acted. She had grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the kitchen. With a desperate cry, she swung it with all her might, connecting with the back of Billy's head. The big man dropped like a stone, unconscious. Now it was just Peters, the detective. He stood there, his gun aimed squarely at Samuel's chest. "Drop the axe, Crawford," Peters said, his voice cold and steady. "It's over." "Is it?" Samuel said, his chest heaving. "You're a Pinkerton. You're supposed to be on the side of the law. You know what kind of man he is. You know he's a criminal." "I'm on the side that pays me," Peters said flatly. "He's not going to pay you now," came Eleanor's voice from the doorway. She was standing there, calm and composed, holding a small, leather-bound book in her hand. One of the ledgers. "But I know someone who will. The United States Marshal Service. They'll pay a handsome reward for these books, and for testimony against a man like Charles Morrison." Peters hesitated, his eyes flicking from the ledger in Eleanor's hand to Charles, who was now whimpering on the porch floor, and back to Samuel. He was a businessman. He was weighing the odds, calculating the profit. Suddenly, another sound cut through the tense standoff. The thundering of hooves. A lot of them. A posse of riders was cresting the hill, heading straight for the ranch. At the front was the sheriff from Copper Ridge. Peters made his calculation. He slowly lowered his gun. "It seems, Mr. Morrison," he said with a wry smile, "that your account is now past due." The sheriff had been alerted by an old friend of Samuel's from a neighboring ranch. Samuel had arranged a signal with him years ago, a simple just-in-case plan for emergencies in the isolated wilderness. 3 shots from his rifle, spaced 10 seconds apart. As soon as Jeb had been locked in the barn while Charles's back was turned, Samuel had grabbed his rifle from beside the door and fired 3 rounds into the air. He never thought he'd actually use the signal, but his friend had heard it and ridden straight for town. The aftermath was messy but swift. Charles Morrison, his thugs, and even the pragmatic Detective Peters were taken into custody. The ledgers Eleanor had so cleverly hidden, not in the well, but tucked away inside a hollowed-out book about crop rotation on Samuel's shelf, were handed over to the federal marshals. They contained enough evidence of fraud, extortion, and bribery to put Charles away for a very long time. His entire criminal empire crumbled to dust. In the quiet days that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the ranch. It wasn't the empty, silent peace of solitude that Samuel had known before. It was a shared peace, earned through terror and courage. The broken furniture was mended, the scars on the land began to heal, and the love between Samuel and Eleanor, now forged in the fires of crisis, deepened into something unbreakable. One evening they sat on the porch, just as they had on their first night together, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. "I'm sorry I lied to you, Samuel," Eleanor said softly. "You did what you had to do to survive," he replied, taking her hand in his. "And you led me to a life I never thought was possible, a life worth fighting for." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand tracing the calloused skin of his. "You were so brave. You were my hero." "No," Samuel said, looking out at the endless prairie, his home. "I'm just a man who found something he wasn't willing to lose." The lonely rancher who had lived for 42 years in silence had finally found his voice. The runaway wife who had been searching for a place to hide had found a place to stand and fight. Their story didn't start with a desperate request for shelter in a storm. It started with a choice. The choice to be brave, the choice to trust, and the choice to fight for a love that was more powerful than any lie and stronger than any fear. They had found in each other not just a partner, but a warrior, and together they had won a life of quiet, beautiful peace. What would you do if your life was turned upside down by a single knock at the door? If you enjoyed this story, and you believe in the kind of love that's worth fighting for, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because you never know when your own second chance is waiting right outside in the storm.